The millionaire thought coming home before sunrise erased his mistakes. The house was quiet, untouched, safe. Then he saw the toy on the kitchen table, the one he bought and forgot to give. What he didn't know was that this small object wasn't a gift. It was a goodbye he never saw coming. Before we begin, take a breath with me for a moment. These stories aren't just told to be heard. They're meant to be felt. Somewhere inside them, there's always a piece of real life, a reminder that hearts still matter and people can still choose better. If this space feels like home to you, leave a kind word below. Every positive comment helps keep this place alive, connected, and human. The front door clicked shut with a softness that felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced it 1,000 times in his head on the drive over. Dawn hadn't fully arrived yet, just that thin gray light that made everything look forgiving if you squinted hard enough. He stood there for a second, keys still in his hand, breathing in the familiar air of the house, and telling himself this was just another return, another successful escape. A millionaire affair left no fingerprints if you were careful. He loosened his jacket, the faint scent of expensive cologne trailing behind him, a scent that definitely wasn't his wife's. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself a lot of things. He slipped off his shoes and placed them exactly where they always went, muscle memory doing the work, while his mind floated somewhere between relief and exhaustion. The house was quiet in that particular way that only early morning could manage, not asleep exactly, just holding its breath. He checked his phone instinctively. No missed calls, no messages. A small smile tugged at his mouth. See? Safe. Always safe. As he moved toward the kitchen, his thoughts drifted back to the night before. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the soft hands on his arm, the way time seemed to bend around him when no one was asking anything of him. He had felt light, untethered. Guilt and regret were things for later, things he could afford because he always fixed things with money or distance. Fatherhood reckoning was a phrase people liked to throw around in books and interviews, not something that knocked on your door at dawn. He reached for the light switch in the kitchen, flicked it on, and froze. There, in the middle of the table, sat a small box. Brightly colored, cheap plastic packaging. A toy. He blinked once, then again, as if the image might rearrange itself into something less inconvenient. His chest tightened in a way he didn't expect. He took a step closer, slowly, like the toy might accuse him out loud if he moved too fast. The forgotten toy stared back at him, cartoon eyes wide and cheerful, completely out of place among the polished countertops and the faint smell of last night's coffee. That's weird, he muttered to no one. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The plastic crinkled softly. The price sticker was still there. The receipt, folded neatly, was tucked under the tape. He frowned, trying to pull the memory forward. He remembered buying it. Barely. A rushed stop at a store, his phone pressed to his ear, promising someone he'd be home soon. He remembered thinking, this'll make up for it. He didn't remember giving it to his child. His throat felt dry. He set the toy back down, more carefully this time, like it might break if he wasn't gentle. The house suddenly felt bigger, emptier. He glanced toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. "Hey," he called out, keeping his voice low. "I'm home." Nothing answered him. No small footsteps. No sleepy voice asking where he'd been. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing outside. Child silence wasn't supposed to feel this loud. He laughed softly, nervously. Still asleep, he told himself. Of course, it was early. Dawn return, right? That was the whole point. He leaned against the counter, rubbing his face, letting the image of the toy settle in his mind. A broken family wasn't built in a single night. It happened in pieces, in excuses, in mornings like this, where something didn't line up quite right. He walked down the hallway, peeking into the bedroom he shared with his wife. The bed was made. Two made. No rumpled sheets, no indentation on her side. His stomach twisted, but he pushed the feeling down. She must have gone to the couch, or out early, or anywhere else that fit better with the story he preferred. He moved to the smaller bedroom, opening the door just enough to look inside. The curtains were drawn, but light leaked through the edges. The bed was empty. He stepped in fully now, scanning the room. The shelf where his child kept their favorite things looked thinner. Not empty, just reduced. He swallowed hard. Back in the kitchen, he sat down at the table across from the toy. He picked up the receipt, smoothing it out with his thumb. Yesterday's date, his name on the card. Proof of intention, without follow-through. Guilt and regret crept in slowly, like they had all the time in the world. He pulled out his phone again and typed a message to his wife. Home. Talk later. He stared at it, then deleted it. Typed another. Everything okay? Deleted that too. He didn't send anything. Control felt safer than honesty. His eyes drifted back to the toy, and for the first time, he noticed something else. A small smudge on the table beside it, like a fingerprint that had been wiped away in a hurry. A sign someone had been there, had touched it, had waited. The realization landed heavier than he expected. He sat there, dawn light creeping further into the room, and felt something inside him shift. The night was over. The excuses were wearing thin. And that small, forgotten toy felt less like a gift now, and more like a message he didn't yet understand, but knew he couldn't ignore. He didn't realize how long he'd been sitting there, until the light in the kitchen shifted, creeping across the table in a thin stripe that cut right through the forgotten toy. Morning was advancing whether he was ready or not. He rested his elbows on the table, hands clasped loosely, staring at that small piece of plastic as if it might suddenly explain itself. The house felt different now, not hostile, not angry, just distant. Like it had decided to stop pretending everything was fine. He picked up the toy again, this time squeezing it lightly, testing the cheap mechanism inside. It made a soft, cheerful sound that echoed far too loudly in the quiet kitchen. He winced and quickly set it back down. The sound lingered in his ears, colliding with memories he hadn't planned to visit so early in the day. He remembered standing in the store aisle, distracted, half listening to a voice on the phone, nodding to himself as he grabbed the first thing that looked right. He remembered telling himself that it was the thought that counted, that the timing could always be fixed later. Later was a word he leaned on heavily. Later had carried him through missed dinners, delayed weekends, postponed conversations. Later had finally caught up with him. He dragged a hand down his face and exhaled slowly. The smell of unfamiliar cologne clung to his shirt, suddenly noticeable in a way it hadn't been when he walked in. It didn't belong here, just like the toy. Just like the version of himself who thought slipping back before dawn erased the night entirely. Millionaire affair, dawn return, control intact. That had been the plan. Plans, however, had a way of unraveling when children were involved, because children noticed what adults convinced themselves to ignore. He stood and walked toward the sink, rinsing his hands even though they weren't dirty. The water ran longer than necessary. He watched it swirl down the drain and felt a strange sense of pressure building behind his ribs. He shut the faucet off abruptly and leaned against the counter, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. He looked tired, older than he remembered feeling the night before. Guilt and regret were beginning to surface, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a tide he couldn't hold back much longer. He moved back to the table and sat again, this time pulling the receipt free from the tape. He flattened it carefully, as if respecting it might somehow rewrite the story. Yesterday's date stared back at him. The amount barely registered. The time did, early evening. He'd promised he'd be home by then. He closed his eyes, replaying the moment his child had asked if he was coming back that night. He'd answered without hesitation, because hesitation would have revealed too much. Of course, he'd said, smiling, already thinking about something else. The chair scraped softly as he pushed it back and stood. He needed movement, needed to convince himself that action still meant something. He walked through the living room again, slower now, noticing details he'd skimmed past earlier. A framed drawing sat on the side table, tilted slightly. He straightened it, then paused. The colors were faded from sunlight, but the figures were clear enough. 3 of them, all holding hands. He swallowed and turned away. He walked toward the hallway, stopping in front of his child's bedroom once more. This time, he didn't just peek inside. He stepped in fully and closed the door behind him, sealing himself into the quiet. The air smelled faintly of soap and something sweet he couldn't place. He crossed to the desk and ran his fingers over its surface, feeling the faint grooves left by crayons pressed too hard. He opened the drawer. Empty, except for a single folded paper. He lifted it, unfolding it carefully. It was a practice sheet, letters written unevenly, some backward. His name appeared at the top, spelled correctly. That small fact hit him harder than it should have. He sat on the floor, back against the bed, paper resting in his lap. This wasn't panic yet. It was something slower, heavier. The creeping understanding that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a quick errand. This was absence with intention. Child silence with meaning. He pressed his lips together and breathed through his nose, grounding himself the way he'd learned to do in boardrooms when deals went sideways. This wasn't a negotiation. There were no terms to adjust. He stood and went back to the entryway again, checking the shoe rack for a 3rd time, as if repetition might conjure something new. It didn't. He glanced at the coat hooks. One jacket was missing, the smaller one with the stubborn zipper. His wife hadn't taken much. That much was clear. Just what mattered. The realization settled deep in his chest, heavy and undeniable. Broken family didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, through careful selection. He returned to the kitchen and leaned against the counter, eyes drifting back to the toy. He imagined his child seeing it there, untouched, and felt a sharp twist of shame. Maybe they'd waited. Maybe they'd asked about it. Maybe they'd decided it didn't matter anymore. The thought made his throat tighten. Fatherhood reckoning wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic apologies. It was about moments like this, where you realize too late which ones had mattered most. He picked up his phone and typed another message to his wife. "We need to talk." He stared at it, thumb hovering. He deleted it. Typed again. "Where are you?" Deleted. He finally locked the phone and set it face down on the counter, as if removing the option entirely would restore some sense of order. He wasn't ready to hear what she might say. Or worse, not say. The house creaked softly as it settled, responding to the morning warmth. He straightened, rolled his shoulders, and took one last look at the toy. It sat there patiently, unchanged, waiting, not demanding, not accusing, just present. And in that quiet presence, he felt the full weight of what he'd neglected settle over him. He understood then, with a clarity that left no room for denial, that the toy didn't belong there because it was never meant to replace him. It wasn't a solution or an apology. It was proof. Proof of promises made too easily and kept too rarely. Proof that while he'd been busy managing appearances and convincing himself he was untouchable, something far more fragile had slipped out of reach. He reached out and placed the toy carefully back in the center of the table, aligning it just so, as if order might still mean something. Outside, the day continued to wake up. Inside, he stood alone, surrounded by quiet, finally understanding that this silence was only the beginning. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. If you were in his place, what would you do right now? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Give this story a rating from 0 to 10 so far. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support, especially in the chat, helps keep these stories alive until the very end. He thought the worst part would be the silence, but it wasn't. It was the way the silence changed as the minutes passed, as if the house itself were adjusting to a new reality without bothering to inform him. He moved through the rooms again, slower this time, more deliberate, like a man searching for a lost item he already knew wouldn't be found. Every step felt heavier than the last, the polished floors cold beneath his feet. This house had always felt impressive, controlled, a reflection of his success. Now it felt hollow, like a showroom after closing hours. He stopped in the hallway and listened. Nothing. No hum of a tablet left charging, no muffled cartoon voices from a forgotten screen, no footsteps running back and forth. Just the distant murmur of the city waking up outside. The absence pressed against his ears until he found himself holding his breath without realizing it. He let it out slowly, forcing himself to move again. In the bedroom he shared with his wife, he opened the closet properly this time. Her side was neater than usual, stripped down to essentials. Dresses he knew she rarely wore were gone. Shoes he'd never noticed, but suddenly remembered seeing lined up carefully were missing. She hadn't packed in anger. She hadn't grabbed things randomly. This had been done with thought, with restraint. That unsettled him more than any dramatic exit ever could have. Broken family didn't always explode. Sometimes it dismantled itself quietly, piece by piece. He moved to the knitstand and opened the drawer, half expecting to find a note. There was nothing but a book and a pair of earrings. He closed it gently, almost respectfully, and leaned back against the bed. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine that this was temporary, a cooling-off period, a tactic. She'd always been practical, logical. He told himself she'd come back once things settled, once emotions cooled. He told himself that because the alternative felt too final. He walked into the bathroom and noticed her toothbrush was gone. Such a small thing, but it hit him hard. The kind of detail you didn't fake. The kind of thing you took only if you didn't plan on returning soon. He stared at the empty cup, his reflection looking back at him from the mirror with a confusion he wasn't used to seeing on his own face. Guilt and regret stirred again, sharper now, harder to ignore. He left the bedroom and headed for his child's room once more, as if drawn there by gravity. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. The bed was made, but not the way he made it. Tighter, careful, the kind of effort someone made when they were trying to be gentle with a goodbye. He crossed the room and sat down, resting his hands on his knees, scanning every inch. A few toys remained, lined up neatly on the shelf, but the favorites were gone, the ones that had names, the ones he'd occasionally tripped over and complained about. He reached up and touched the wall where the growth chart still hung. The pencil marks ended abruptly, like a sentence cut off mid-thought. He traced the last line again, slower this time, his chest tightening. Fatherhood reckoning wasn't a single moment of realization. It was a series of small recognitions stacking up until you couldn't breathe under the weight of them anymore. He noticed something else then. The backpack hook by the door was empty, the small jacket hook too. He exhaled sharply, standing up too fast. This wasn't a visit. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was departure. Planned, deliberate, and complete. He returned to the kitchen, his movements restless now, pacing the length of the room. The forgotten toy still sat on the table, unchanged, as if mocking his need for certainty. He picked it up, then set it down again, unable to decide what to do with it. He imagined his child waking up somewhere else, noticing its absence, and the thought sent a jolt of panic through him. Dawn's return suddenly felt like a cruel joke. He had come back to a house that no longer needed him. He grabbed his phone and tried calling his wife again. Straight to voicemail. He tried a third time, then a fourth, his confidence dissolving with every unanswered ring. He didn't leave a message. He didn't know what to say that wouldn't sound hollow now. Words felt inadequate, flimsy compared to the quiet efficiency of what she'd done. He leaned against the counter and stared at the clock. Time moved forward, indifferent. He thought about the night before, about how easily he'd laughed, how convinced he'd been that he was still in control. The contrast made his stomach twist. Millionaire affair, expensive dinners, whispered promises that meant nothing in the light of morning. None of it mattered here. None of it could fill this space. His eyes drifted to the refrigerator, and that's when he saw it. A piece of paper held up by a magnet, slightly crooked. He hadn't noticed it before. He stepped closer, heart pounding harder now. It was a drawing, his child's drawing. The figures were simple, the lines uneven, but the scene was unmistakable. A house, a son, two smaller figures holding hands, one taller figure standing slightly apart. At the bottom, in careful, uneven letters, was a date. Yesterday. His throat closed. Yesterday. While he'd been elsewhere, convincing himself everything was fine. His child had drawn this, had left it here, not hidden, not tucked away, displayed, a quiet record of how things already felt to them. Child silence had been speaking long before this morning. He just hadn't been listening. He peeled the drawing off the fridge and held it carefully, afraid it might tear. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. This wasn't anger. It was something deeper. A realization settling into his bones that he'd been absent long before anyone packed a bag. That the broken family he was now standing in hadn't broken overnight. He lowered himself into a chair, the drawing in one hand, the forgotten toy within reach. Outside, the city noise grew louder, the world continuing on as if nothing had changed. Inside, he sat still, the weight of what he'd lost pressing down on him. He understood now that this house didn't feel empty because it lacked noise. It felt empty because the people who gave it life had left, and they hadn't taken the silence with them. They'd left it behind for him to sit in, to finally hear. He lost count of how many times he checked the phone after that. It became a reflex, almost involuntary, like breathing or blinking. He would set it down, take 2 steps away, then turn back and pick it up again, convinced something must have changed in the last 10 seconds. Nothing ever had. The screen stayed stubbornly blank. No notifications, no incoming calls, no sign that anyone on the other end even realized he was spiraling. The silence between missed calls stretched wider with every attempt, filling the room with a tension that made his shoulders ache. He tried his wife's number again, pacing as it rang. 1 ring, 2, 3. Voicemail. His jaw clenched, irritation flaring up instinctively before being swallowed by something heavier. Pick up, he muttered under his breath, as if volume might somehow bridge the distance. He ended the call before the tone, refusing to leave a message that would sound weak or confused. He told himself she was doing this on purpose, letting him sit in it, letting the absence speak for her. The thought made his chest tighten, but it also rang painfully true. He stopped pacing and leaned against the wall, phone pressed to his ear, long after the call had ended. His reflection stared back at him from the hallway mirror, eyes rimmed with red, expression unfamiliar. This wasn't the face he wore in meetings or at dinners. This was a man caught off guard, stripped of the certainty he relied on. Guilt and regret hummed beneath the surface now, constant, unavoidable. He wondered when exactly things had slipped beyond his control. Not dramatically, not in a single argument, but quietly, through a series of choices he barely registered at the time. He thought about calling his assistant, asking if she'd heard from his wife, then dismissed the idea. Dragging anyone else into this felt wrong, invasive. This was personal, even if he'd spent years blurring that line whenever it suited him. Broken family wasn't something you outsourced. It sat with you, demanded your attention, refused to be managed like a crisis at work. He sat down at the kitchen table again, elbows resting on the cool surface, head in his hands. The forgotten toy sat just inches away, the drawing folded beside it. He stared at both, then closed his eyes. Images came uninvited. His child standing in the doorway weeks ago, backpack slung over one shoulder, asking if he'd make it to a school event. He remembered glancing at his calendar, seeing the overlap, and saying, "I'll try." He remembered the way their face had fallen just slightly, so fast he'd almost missed it. Almost. He opened his eyes and felt something sharp lodge itself in his throat. He hadn't tried. Not really. He'd sent an apology afterward, maybe a promise to make it up next time. Next time had become a pattern. Fatherhood reckoning didn't come with warning labels. It crept up on you through moments you brushed off as insignificant. He tried calling again, this time more slowly, deliberately. The phone rang longer than before, and his heart kicked up, hope flaring embarrassingly fast. Then it went to voicemail again. He laughed once, short and humorless, and ended the call. "Fine," he said aloud. "Fine." The word echoed back at him, empty. He scrolled through his contacts and stopped on his child's name. He stared at it, thumb hovering, then locked the phone instead. It felt like a line he couldn't cross yet. What would he say? "Where are you? Are you okay? I'm sorry?" None of it felt sufficient. None of it could undo the quiet efficiency with which they'd left. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. People moved about their mornings, coffee cups in hand, conversations overlapping, life continuing uninterrupted. He felt oddly detached from it, like he was watching from behind glass. The dawn return he'd planned so carefully had delivered him back into a reality he no longer recognized. The house behind him felt too large now, every room a reminder of what was missing. He thought about the night before again, about the way he'd ignored the clock, the way he'd silenced the small voice in his head reminding him of home. Millionaire affair, easy laughter, the illusion of escape. It all felt cheap now, flimsy compared to the weight of this quiet. He wondered if his wife had watched the clock that night too, waiting, realizing something had shifted permanently. His phone buzzed suddenly in his hand, and his heart jumped so hard it made him dizzy. He looked down, breath caught, only to see a generic notification. Nothing from her. The disappointment was immediate and physical, a sharp drop that left him feeling foolish for hoping. He turned the phone face down on the windowsill, as if punishing it for the false alarm. He went back to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, hands shaking slightly. He drank it too fast, barely tasting it, then poured another. The quiet pressed in again, thicker now, heavier. Child silence wasn't passive. It was active, deliberate. It said things he couldn't ignore anymore. He sat down and let his mind wander backward, revisiting moments he'd dismissed at the time. The way his wife had stopped reminding him of things. The way she'd started doing everything herself. The way his child had grown quieter around him, less demanding, as if adjusting expectations to match reality. The realization settled over him like a slow, suffocating fog. This hadn't been sudden. It had been building for a long time. He finally unlocked his phone again and opened his messages, typing without thinking. "I'm home. Please call me." He read it twice, then sent it before he could talk himself out of it. The message disappeared into the void, delivered but unanswered. He stared at the screen, waiting for the little indicator to change, for something to happen. Nothing did. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, exhaling slowly. The silence between missed calls wasn't just about unanswered phones. It was the space where everything he'd avoided finally had room to surface. And as the morning wore on, that silence grew heavier, more deliberate, making one thing painfully clear. Whatever came next wouldn't be on his terms anymore. He didn't remember sitting down, but suddenly he was on the floor of his child's room, his back against the side of the bed, knees drawn up slightly, like the posture alone might shrink the size of what he was feeling. The house had gone still again, not the tense stillness from earlier, but something heavier, like it was waiting to see what he would do next. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, cutting soft lines across the floor, illuminating dust he'd never noticed before. Everything felt exposed now, stripped of the protection that night and distraction had given him. He held the forgotten toy in his hands, turning it over and over, thumb rushing across the plastic seam. Up close, it looked even more ordinary. Something grabbed in a rush, something meant to stand in for time, for attention, for an apology he never quite voiced. He remembered tossing it onto the counter the night before, telling himself he'd give it to his child in the morning, that dawn return would somehow reset everything. The lie felt almost laughable now. There was no reset button. There never had been. He closed his eyes, and the memories came faster than he could stop them. His child standing on a chair in the kitchen months ago, proudly holding up a paper crown they'd made at school. Him nodding, distracted, phone pressed to his ear, saying, "That's awesome," without really looking. A bedtime story cut short because he had an early meeting. A promise to go to the park that turned into a rain check that turned into silence. Guilt and regret weren't abstract concepts anymore. They were specific. They had faces. They had dates. He opened his eyes and looked around the room, noticing things he'd ignored before. The corner where a nightlight had once been plugged in was empty now. A faint square on the wall showed where a poster had been removed. He stood up slowly, knees stiff, and crossed to the desk again. He opened the drawer he'd checked earlier, more carefully this time, as if respect might conjure answers. Beneath a stack of papers, something caught his eye. It was a small folded note. His breath caught as he picked it up. The paper was creased from being folded and unfolded more than once, the edges soft. He hesitated, a strange sense of dread settling over him, then unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was uneven, letters crowded together, some leaning too far to one side. He recognized it immediately. "Dad, thank you for the toy. I like it. I'm sorry I didn't wait. Mom said you were busy. I didn't want you to feel bad." He stared at the words, reading them again and again, each pass making them heavier. The apology lodged in his chest like a stone. His child was apologizing to him for leaving, for not waiting. The realization knocked the air out of him. He sank back onto the bed, note trembling in his hands. "I wasn't busy," he whispered aloud, the words sounding thin even to his own ears. Or maybe that was the problem. He had been busy, just not with the right things. Millionaire affair, endless meetings, dinners that ran late because he let them. He'd been busy building an image, maintaining a life that looked impressive from the outside and felt increasingly empty on the inside. Fatherhood reckoning wasn't a confrontation. It was this. A child believing they were an inconvenience. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, willing the tightness to ease. His throat burned, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. He didn't cry, not fully, but something broke loose inside him all the same. A sound escaped him, halfway between a laugh and a sob, raw and unpolished. He hadn't earned the right to fall apart dramatically. That felt like another indulgence. But the weight was there, undeniable. He stood again and walked slowly through the house, note still in his hand. Every step echoed, every room feeling more distant now that he understood what the silence meant. He passed the kitchen table, the toy still sitting exactly where he'd left it, and felt a sharp twist of shame. His child had thanked him for something that had never reached them, had softened their own disappointment to protect him. The broken family he was standing in wasn't the result of one mistake. It was the cumulative effect of choices made without thinking they would cost anything real. He leaned against the counter and stared out the window again. The city moved on, indifferent. He wondered where his child was right now, if they were unpacking, if they were trying to be brave. The thought that they might be reassuring their mother, telling her they were fine, that Dad would understand, cut deeper than any accusation ever could have. He walked back into the living room and sank onto the couch, the note resting in his lap. He read it one last time, slower now, absorbing every word. The line about not wanting him to feel bad echoed loudest. That had been his unspoken expectation for years. That everyone else would adjust, accommodate, soften the consequences of his absence so he wouldn't have to face them head on. He looked around the room, at the carefully chosen furniture, the art he'd picked because it impressed people, the space that had once been filled with noise and now felt staged. This life had been built with precision, with intention. And yet, he'd neglected the one part of it that required something he couldn't delegate or delay: presence. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket, close to his chest, as if keeping it there might anchor him. He picked up the toy and held it, heavier now than its weight suggested. For the first time since he'd walked through the door at dawn, he didn't reach for his phone. He didn't think about damage control or next steps. He just stood there, letting the truth settle in. This wasn't about being forgiven yet. It wasn't about grand gestures or sudden transformations. It was about acknowledging what he'd done, what he'd failed to do, and the cost of that failure. Guilt had finally found its voice, and it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, impossible to ignore. And as he stood alone in the center of the house, toy in hand and note in his pocket, he understood that whatever came next would demand more from him than money or promises ever could. He sat at the kitchen table again, the note unfolded in front of him, the toy pushed slightly to the side as if giving the words space to breathe. He read the message slowly, deliberately, forcing himself not to skim, not to rush past the parts that hurt the most. The handwriting wobbled in places, letters uneven, the kind of effort that came from concentrating too hard, from wanting to get it right. Every line felt intentional. Every word felt chosen with care far beyond the years of the child who wrote it. Thank you for the toy. I like it. That part should have made him smile. Instead, it tightened something in his chest. The gratitude felt misplaced, unearned. He imagined his child saying it out loud, polite, careful, trying to sound grown-up. He imagined them holding the toy briefly, then setting it back down, unsure if they were allowed to be excited. The image stung. He had taught them that restraint without meaning to, had modeled absence so consistently that it became normal. I'm sorry, I didn't wait. His fingers curled against the table. Sorry for not waiting. Sorry for expecting him. Sorry for believing promises that had become flexible in his hands. The apology felt backward, a reversal of roles that made his stomach churn. Children weren't supposed to apologize for needing their parents. Somewhere along the line, he had let that belief take root. Mom said you were busy. He closed his eyes when he read that line, his breath catching. Busy, the word he'd hidden behind, so often it had become armor. He wondered how many times his wife had used it gently, trying to soften the blow for their child. How many times she'd chosen that word instead of the truth, trying to protect both of them. The realization hurt in a way that was almost physical. I didn't want you to feel bad. That was the line that finally broke him. He stared at it, vision blurring, and felt something inside him give way. A quiet, controlled fracture, not dramatic enough to announce itself, but deep enough to change everything. His child had been managing his emotions, had been thinking about how to protect him from discomfort. That wasn't innocence. That was adaptation. And it terrified him. He leaned back in his chair and let out a shaky breath, one hand covering his mouth as if holding the sound inside mattered. His eyes burned, but he didn't wipe them right away. He let the sensation sit there, raw and unfamiliar. This was the child's truth, unfiltered, unpolished, and it stripped away every excuse he'd clung to. This wasn't about a single night, or a forgotten toy, or even a millionaire affair that made for an easy villain. This was about a pattern that had taught a child to shrink their expectations. He stood abruptly and paced the length of the kitchen, running a hand through his hair, then stopping, then starting again. The house felt smaller now, the walls closer, as if the truth had altered the dimensions. He replayed conversations in his head, moments he'd dismissed as minor. The way his child had stopped asking him to read bedtime stories. The way they'd learned to entertain themselves quietly. The way they'd smiled too quickly when he did show up, as if afraid the moment might vanish if they lingered in it too long. He stopped pacing and leaned against the counter, gripping the edge tightly. Fatherhood reckoning wasn't about realizing you'd been absent. It was about realizing your absence had taught someone how to live without you. The thought hollowed him out. He picked up the note again and folded it carefully, smoothing the creases with his thumb. He didn't want to crumple it or shove it away. It felt like something sacred now, something fragile that deserved care. He slipped it back onto the table and sat down, shoulders slumping, the weight of the morning settling into his bones. His phone buzzed softly against the counter. He flinched, heart jumping, then glanced at the screen. A notification from work. Nothing that mattered. He turned the phone face down again, resisting the urge to throw it across the room. Work had always been the constant, a thing that responded when people didn't. It felt irrelevant now. He imagined his child somewhere else, maybe sitting at another kitchen table, maybe coloring quietly, maybe asking questions they didn't really expect answers to. He wondered if they were blaming themselves for leaving, if they were telling themselves they should have waited longer, should have been more patient. The idea made his chest ache. Child silence had carried so much more weight than he'd understood. He moved back into the living room and sat on the couch, the toy in his hands again. He pressed it once, letting it make its soft sound, then pressed it again, slower this time. The sound echoed faintly, lonely in the quiet room. He imagined his child hearing it and felt a sharp pang of longing. This toy wasn't just a gift. It was a symbol of everything he thought could be fixed later. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He spoke quietly, as if his child might hear him anyway. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said, voice unsteady. The words felt inadequate, but they were a start. He repeated them, softer. "You didn't do anything wrong." The house didn't respond. It didn't need to. The truth had already been delivered. He straightened slowly, feeling older, heavier, but also clearer than he had in years. The child's note hadn't accused him. It hadn't demanded anything. It had simply revealed the cost of his absence in the most honest way possible. That honesty was devastating. It was also undeniable. He placed the toy back on the table, right beside the folded note, and stood there for a long moment, hands resting on the edge, head bowed slightly. He understood now that whatever came next couldn't be about defending himself or rewriting the past. It had to be about listening, really listening, even when it hurt. A child's truth had spoken, quietly and clearly, and it left no room for denial. The morning had fully arrived by the time he noticed how tired he was. Not the kind of tired that came from a long night or too much drinking, but the deep, hollow exhaustion that settled into your bones when something fundamental shifted. He stood in the hallway, hands on his hips, staring at nothing in particular, trying to orient himself in a house that no longer felt like his. The note and the toy remained on the kitchen table behind him, silent witnesses he couldn't bring himself to put away. Moving them felt like erasing proof, and he wasn't ready to do that yet. He walked into his home office, a room he'd always associated with control. Everything had its place there. Clean lines, minimal clutter, screens that responded when he touched them. He powered on his laptop and sat down, posture stiff, as if preparing for a meeting he couldn't afford to lose. Old habits surfaced easily when he felt threatened. If emotions were spiraling, logic usually stepped in to stabilize things. He told himself he just needed information, facts, context, something solid to hold on to. He opened his email and scrolled past messages he couldn't care less about now. Deals, schedules, requests that suddenly felt absurdly unimportant. He searched his inbox deliberately, typing in keywords he hadn't thought much about before. Legal, school, enrollment. The results appeared faster than he expected. His stomach tightened as he opened the first message, then the second. There it was, weeks ago. A subject line he'd skimmed and dismissed because it didn't seem urgent at the time. Update regarding educational arrangements. He clicked it open, reading more carefully now, his heart pounding with every sentence. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was precise, professional, and unmistakably clear. A change of address had been submitted. Temporary custody arrangements updated. Emergency contacts revised. His name still appeared there, but no longer at the top. He leaned back in his chair slowly, as if sudden movement might make it worse. He remembered signing something digitally late one night, distracted, barely reading beyond the surface. He'd trusted that nothing important would happen without his direct involvement. He'd trusted the system he'd built to protect him from inconvenience. The realization hit hard. This hadn't been rushed. This had been planned quietly, patiently, while he was busy elsewhere. He stood up abruptly and paced the office, running a hand through his hair. No, he said aloud, though no one was there to hear it. No, this can't be final. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't the kind of thing you undid with a phone call or a check. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a decision that had been made carefully, long before the night he'd thought mattered. He returned to the laptop and opened another message, this one from a school administrator. The tone was polite, warm even, welcoming his child to a new routine, outlining drop-off times and contact procedures. He read it twice, then a third time, the words blurring together. His child had a new routine, a new normal, one that didn't revolve around waiting for him. He closed the laptop and rested his hands on the desk, head bowed. The office felt smaller now, less impressive. All the money, all the influence, all the leverage he wielded so easily outside these walls meant nothing here. Broken family wasn't something you negotiated your way out of. It didn't respond to authority. It responded only to presence, and he'd already missed too much of that. He thought about calling a lawyer, about asserting his rights, about pushing back. The thoughts surfaced automatically, reflexively, but they felt wrong, hollow. He imagined his child's note again, the apology written in uneven letters, and felt a sharp wave of shame. What would a fight accomplish now? What would it teach them? That love was conditional? That power always won? He exhaled slowly, forcing the thoughts aside. He walked back into the kitchen and stood over the table, staring down at the toy and the folded note. Too late to undo. The phrase echoed in his mind, heavy and final. He could see the chain of moments clearly now, each one leading inevitably to this point. The missed dinners, the half-listened conversations, the promises postponed until they lost meaning. None of it felt dramatic at the time. That was the danger of it. He picked up the toy and turned it over in his hands, then set it down again. I didn't think you'd actually leave, he said quietly, as if speaking to his wife, to his child, to himself. The truth of that admission settled heavily. He'd assumed permanence without earning it. He'd mistaken patience for acceptance. He sank into a chair and stared at the wall, the clock ticking steadily nearby. Time had always been his ally, something he bent and shaped around his needs. Now it felt like an adversary, marking moments he couldn't get back. Fatherhood reckoning wasn't about making amends instantly. It was about sitting with the damage long enough to understand it. He glanced at his phone again, unlocked it, and scrolled through old photos. There were more than he remembered. Small moments captured and forgotten. His child asleep in the back seat. A crooked smile at a birthday party he'd arrived late to. Each image felt like a reminder of something he'd taken for granted. He set the phone down gently, resisting the urge to call again, to demand answers he wasn't entitled to anymore. He stood and walked to the window one last time, watching the city move on without him. The world hadn't paused for his realization. It never did. But something inside him had slowed, forcing him to finally see what had been happening all along. He understood now that some things couldn't be fixed quickly, no matter how badly you wanted them to be. Some consequences weren't punishment, they were clarity. And as he stood there, alone in a house that no longer breathed the same way, he accepted a truth he could no longer avoid. Whatever came next would require patience, humility, and a willingness to show up without guarantees. Because this wasn't about undoing the past anymore. It was about whether he could become someone worth waiting for, even if waiting was no longer an option. He remained standing in the kitchen, long after the decision had already been made, though he hadn't consciously named it yet. The table stood at the center of the room like a quiet witness. The forgotten toy still placed carefully where he'd left it, the folded note beside it. Sunlight poured in through the window now, full and unapologetic, illuminating every surface, every detail he had ignored for years. The house no longer hid anything. It didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already been revealed. He reached for the toy slowly, lifting it with both hands as if it were fragile, though it wasn't. The plastic was smooth, light, almost weightless. And yet, it carried more meaning than any object he had ever bought. He turned it over, noticing a small scratch along the side, probably from being handled briefly and set down again. He imagined his child holding it, feeling its shape, then deciding not to play with it yet. Maybe waiting for him, maybe hoping. The thought tightened his chest until breathing felt deliberate. For years, he had believed that gifts were proof. That effort could be measured in purchases, in receipts, and how quickly he could make disappointment disappear with something new and shiny. That belief had served him well in business. It had failed him completely at home. The meaning of the forgotten toy wasn't in what it was, but in what it tried to replace. Time, attention, consistency, things he had treated as flexible, negotiable, endlessly postponable. He walked through the house again, slower than before, carrying the toy with him like a reminder he didn't want to set down yet. The living room felt larger in daylight, the furniture arranged perfectly, untouched. He remembered how often his child used to sprawl on the floor there, toys scattered everywhere, laughter echoing off the walls. He'd complained about the mess then, about stepping on small plastic pieces in expensive shoes. Now the absence of that mess felt unbearable. In the hallway, he paused, listening. Still nothing. But this time, the silence didn't feel accusatory. It felt instructive. It was showing him exactly what happened when you weren't there long enough. When people learn to move on without expecting you to catch up. He stepped into his child's room and sat on the bed, setting the toy beside him. The room smelled faintly of soap and something familiar he couldn't name. He ran his hand over the blanket, noticing how neatly it had been folded. He imagined his wife doing it carefully, making sure everything looked calm, stable, as if that alone could soften the transition. He imagined his child watching, quiet, trying to be helpful. The image hurt, but he didn't turn away from it. "I get it now," he said softly, voice barely carrying past his own ears. "I really do." The words weren't a promise. They weren't an apology. They were an acknowledgement. Something he'd avoided offering for far too long. He stood and returned to the kitchen, placing the toy back on the table once more. This time, he didn't hesitate. He aligned it carefully, not out of habit, but out of intention. He wanted to see it. He wanted it to stay visible. He wanted to remember this feeling, this clarity, even when the discomfort faded. He picked up his phone again, not with urgency, but with calm resolve. He didn't scroll aimlessly or check notifications. He opened his calendar and began removing obligations, one by one. Meetings that could be rescheduled, trips that could wait, commitments he had accepted out of habit rather than necessity. Each deletion felt like releasing something he'd clung to for too long. He didn't know if this would make a difference, but he knew that continuing as before would only deepen the distance. He typed a short message to his team, something simple, something honest enough, stepping away for personal reasons. He didn't elaborate. For once, he didn't need to. He turned the phone off and set it on the counter, the silence that followed different from before. Lighter, intentional. He leaned against the counter and closed his eyes, taking a slow breath. He didn't imagine dramatic reunions or instant forgiveness. He didn't picture himself being welcomed back with open arms. That fantasy felt undeserved. What he pictured instead was something quieter, showing up when he said he would, sitting through awkward silences, listening without interrupting. Accepting that trust, once fractured, took time to rebuild, if it rebuilt at all. He opened his eyes and looked at the note again, still folded neatly beside the toy. He picked it up and read it one last time, every word etched into him now. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his wallet, tucking it behind his identification. Not hidden, not buried, but close enough to remind him who he needed to be, even when no one was watching. The meaning of the forgotten toy finally settled into place then, clear and unavoidable. It wasn't about the moment he failed to get it. It wasn't about lateness or distraction, or even the affair itself. It was about presence. About how love didn't live in promises or purchases, but in showing up consistently, without needing to be asked. The toy hadn't been forgotten by chance. It had been forgotten because he wasn't there when it mattered. And now it stood as proof of what absence taught people to do. He grabbed his keys and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. He looked back one last time at the kitchen table, at the toy still resting there in the sunlight. He left it where it was. Some reminders weren't meant to be carried. They were meant to stay, to mark a place where things changed. When he stepped outside, the air felt cooler, sharper. The city moved around him, unaware, indifferent. He locked the door behind him and stood there for a moment, grounding himself. He didn't know when he would see his child again. He didn't know what that meeting would look like, or if he would be welcomed at all. What he knew was this: whatever happened next, he couldn't afford to disappear again. He walked down the steps and into the day, not feeling redeemed, not feeling absolved, but feeling something far more important: responsibility. And as he moved forward, the image of the forgotten toy stayed with him, not as a symbol of failure alone, but as a quiet promise to himself, that if he was given another chance to be present, he wouldn't wait until it was almost too late to show up.